Peace and love, this is yours truly, General Power, known as Shadowz of the House of Hip Step.
Big Shadow.
Just giving you a shout out, you know what I'm saying, on this beautiful day, another beautiful day. Welcome to the NGR Exposed YouTube channel with yours truly. And, you know, this channel, once again, is designed to present you with nothing but the facts. And to promote my book, NGR, What Does It Mean? An expose on the N-word from a hip-hop perspective. And to expose the facts within that book, because I lay down some critical facts and some critical information in that book. And I present not only the information, but also the references where I got it from. And it's available on Amazon right now. That's NGR, What Does It Mean? An expose on the N-word from a hip-hop perspective by yours truly. P.E. McCallum is my author name. But you all know me as Pow Shadowz. Most people know me as Pow Shadowz. So let's dig into some things. You know, it's today is July the 5th, and it's one day after July 4th, 4th of July, aka Independence Day. And it's a reason that I put the parentheses around independence. You know what I'm saying? It's a reason for that. And we'll get into that right now. So even though this channel is about NGR, since it is July 5th, I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about Independence Day. And the reason being is because, do you know that Independence Day is seriously connected to what we call black and indigenous people in North America today? Yeah, Independence Day is directly connected to the black and indigenous people in North America. A lot of people don't know that the first person to die in the American Revolution. First, let's talk about briefly what is Independence Day, right? And remember, this channel is to discuss everything surrounding the N-word, but also black and indigenous culture, what we call black and indigenous culture today in this country. So, I think it's appropriate to discuss that. You know, during the 1700s, this country, America, was still under Britain rule. All right, the 13 colonies of Britain, all right, are the foundation of America, and then the rest of America was gained through acquisition of land, primarily through forcefully taking, and in many instances the trickery that was presented to the indigenous people that was here, the aboriginals. So, but at this time it was only 13 colonies, and these 13 colonies were controlled by Britain. They were subjugated by Britain, right? Subjects of Britain. So Britain was taxing them. That means all the work that America was the colonists, they were called, it's not America at the time, that the colonists was doing, they had to pay Britain all the work. So just imagine you over here doing all this work and you just getting taxed heavily. And it's an economic situation, just like all revolutions and all uprisings, you know, tend to come from some type of oppression. Usually financial oppression is going to be tied in there, you know, and that's when you'll see the revolution. And the American Revolution was no different. The colonists were wanting to break free from the rule of Britain, and the reason being is because Britain, like I said, was heavily taxing the Americans, the colonists, and they were very dissatisfied with what was going on. So you have a situation where a man by the name of Crispus Attucks was drinking at the bar, and what would happen is some of these British soldiers, they were like the police of the day to the colonists. And tensions began to arise between the British soldiers and the colonists because there wasn't a lot of work for the colonists, and the money was low, and Britain was taking a lot of the taxing the colonists and these things, and the colonists were having to work multiple jobs, just like today, right? They were having to work multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. So what they did was, tensions began to rise between the colonists and the British soldiers, who were like the police of the day, the redcoats. And because they would take the colonists' jobs, like they would take the colonists' jobs. They would be police, but then they would also, be working and taking the colonists' jobs. They would, from what I understand and what I recall about that. And so anyway, long story short, tensions began to rise between the British soldiers and the colonists. And in steps a man named Crispus Attucks. And here's where the black and indigenous people, as we call them, come into play with this story about the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, and the colonists breaking free from Britain. And Crispus Attucks was a whaler. He worked on the ships. Fishermen at sea. Heavily involved in maritime industries. Hard-working man. He's described as a hard-working man. His mother was of indigenous descent. Or what we call Native American descent today. And his father was of African descent. And what you are going to learn on this channel is that the so-called Africans and the so-called American black people are indigenous to all the territories of the world and are related and fall under what we call the Afro gene, or the so-called African ethnicity groups, so-called, but some people describe as Afro gene, or what we would today just say simply, these are all black folk. Because when as I outline in my book, NGR, what does it mean? I quote Empress Verdiasi, and you'll hear me talk about her a lot and talk about this a lot on this channel. And that particularly the indigenous people, the so-called Native Americans of the southeast of this territory called the United States, were what we today call black people, or African Americans today. That's the people that we call black or African Americans today, are the same bloodlines and lineages of the so-called Native Americans of the South, because the South and the Southeast and many parts of the Midwest, the so-called Native Americans belong to what? The copper-colored races, right? We talk about and I constantly remind you of the 1828 Webster's Dictionary of an American, which states that the term American refers to the Aboriginal people of North America who belong to the copper-colored races who were founded here by the Europeans when they came to North America, a term now applied to the descendants of Europeans. Right within that, there is a shift of legacy. All right? The term American, right there, according to the 1828 Webster definition, shifts the legacy of an American. It shows us and outlines that the term American was originally applied to the members of the copper-colored races. The copper-colored races. Right? That penny blends into my skin, don't it? Because I am a copper-colored person. So, the term American applies to the copper-colored races founded here by the Europeans, a term now applied to the Europeans. Remember, ignorance is fear. Ignorance breeds fear. Okay? And what we dealing with is the facts. This has nothing to do with feelings. It's facts over feelings, right? We're just presenting information. So Crispus Attucks was a descendant of the his mother was so-called Native American. His father was so-called African. I also remind you on this channel that it's a misnomer to call the so-called Black Americans Africans, because the numbers of how many people, of how many so-called blacks came over here on the slave ship were inflated. They've been inflated or conflated. These numbers have been exaggerated to make it seem and appear that millions and millions of black people came over here on slave ships. Millions and millions of Africans, specifically, I should say, came over here on slave ships and are now the ancestors of what we call American black people today, are African, and this is why they call us African Americans. And the NGR Exposed channel platform right here, what you're watching today, myself, is Pow Shadowz, is here to tell you that, you know, according to research, that's not the case, and that the so-called black people that you see in America today are descendants of those copper-colored people that were already here. And we continue to, you know, we will continue to reiterate that, you know, on this platform, because it's the facts. It's very little known facts, but just because it's very little known does not make it not the truth. And, you know, now, this is the background of Crispus Attucks. He was of Native American and African lineage according to history, but I just explained to you Africans, Native American, the alternative perspective of those two nationalities. Now, he was a hard-working man, and he and many of the other colonists that he worked with, they would go out for drinking. And the story goes is that after work, you know, like we do today, go out. And the story goes that they were out and about having drinks or whatever, and oftentimes there would be fights that would break out between the colonists and the British soldiers. Just discontent for having an oppressor over you. Does that sound familiar? This is the way that many black and indigenous and brown people feel, you know, even to this day. Many times feel like, you know, the soldiers or the police sometimes have it, you know, out for us. And this is why the protests had occurred of Black Lives Matter protests and the George Floyd protests. It's because in those protests and those riots, you know, and I don't advocate riots, but those protests and those riots were from black, white, Latino. Everybody was out there fighting, just like everybody was out there with the colonists. You know, everybody was out there with the colonists challenging these British people every night. The people who was here. You know, at that time, you know, we didn't have an influx of all these different ethnic groups, but definitely so-called Native Americans, so-called blacks, so-called whites. But as I outlined, the Native Americans and the blacks, that line gets, you know, we got to talk more about that, and we will on this channel, so stay tuned. But today, we're talking about the American Revolution and independence. So, many fights would break out while the colonists and between the colonists and the British soldiers, like, you know, at night, in the night at the bars and at the functions. So was one particular night, you know, things got really, you know, tensions were building. Colonists were starting to want freedom or independence from Britain, British taxation, British overseeing rule. And who can blame them? People that are oppressed or feel oppressed want freedom and liberation and independence from that oppression. So, but Crispus Attucks, the black Native American, he was apparently like walking around with a club that night in his hand, terrorizing the you know, the British soldiers, like with a group of other colonists, and they were just like mixed group, you know what I'm saying, of people of ethnicities out there, like, you know, running up on. I can imagine the colonists running up on the British soldiers, you know, like, you know how people do, like, you know, just, you know what I'm saying, running up on them with the club, like, you know, well, ah. That's funny to me to think about, but, you know, and this, you know, and it got violent, and, you know, one of those incidents turned violent, and there was a standoff, all right, between the colonists and these redcoats, these British cats, and there was a standoff, and in that standoff, somebody licked two shots. They hit Crispus Attucks, and that made Crispus Attucks the first person to die, and that began the American Revolution full on, because at that point there had not been violence. There had only been, you know, there had not been shooting violence. There had been fights and stuff, physical fights and altercations, but not bloodshed like from murder and stuff like that. So Crispus Attucks was the first person who was murdered in the American Revolution, and he was of black and indigenous descent. And then we have to talk about Crispus Attucks when we talk about the 4th of July, Independence Day, and the American Revolution. We have to talk about Crispus Attucks because he was the first to lose his life for this country called America, as we know it today, which became America because of what? The vote took place on July 2nd, 1776, right? To become an independent state. Like, do all these people, all the colonies came together. We want to be independent from Britain? Yes. Who we vote? All say aye, aye, yeah. Nay, no nays, aye, boom. July 2nd, 1776, the colonists voted to become independent from Britain. July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, right? And Thomas Jefferson was the leading, person of that document, at the signing of that document. And when we talk about the Declaration of when we talk about American independence, the colonies getting independent from Britain, we're talking about Crispus Attucks and Thomas Jefferson. Crispus Attucks and Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson, let's look at his background. This is a man of European descent, right? Remember the definition of an American, a term originally applied to the copper-colored races and aboriginals founded here by the Europeans, now applied to descendants of Europeans, right? So, Thomas Jefferson, this is a man of European descent who owned over 600 slaves, and is the man who he owned the more slaves than any other European, or he owned more slaves than any other American president. Thomas Jefferson owned more slaves than any other American president, over 600 to be exact. And yet he was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Independence is that which is opposite of slavery. Independence is opposite of subjugation. And as I support the colonists being independent, becoming independent, and fighting and dying for their independence from Britain, I support a war that happened almost 100 years later, the Civil War, right, in which one of the determining factors was which one of the outcomes of that war was independence, right, for the so-called black people, as we call African Americans today. And I support those who were fighting for the independence, right? I support that as well. I support protests and organized peaceful demonstrative action in order to get independence of oppression from for instance, the systemic harassment from police that, in instances such as Mike Brown, George Floyd, all, two individuals whose death by police, prompted action. Again, I don't agree with the rioting, but what I understand about revolutions is that these things happen, and this is why it's important for governments to always treat people right, because people will become unrest and unruly, and not everybody is gonna, be peaceful or go along with that. They should, because organized peaceful resistance is how the civil rights, many of the civil rights bills were passed, and many the freedoms that we have been afforded today came into existence. And this is why we honor the ancestors. But Thomas Jefferson fighting, imagine Thomas Jefferson, the American, signing the Declaration of Independence, which is these descendants of Europeans fighting for their freedom from Europeans, right, in Europe, namely Great Britain, and signing the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration to be free, while at the same time, Thomas Jefferson signed the Declaration of Independence, which creates the 4th of July holiday. 4th of July, the Independence Day. When he signed that Declaration of Independence, when they all signed it, the delegates. At the same time they were signing the Declaration of Independence, so-called black and Native American people were being enslaved and oppressed in this country. See, both Crispus Attucks' parents were slaves. The African and the Native American side of him were slaves, which should be an indication that they were both ethnically what we call so-called black people today. Right? They talk about how the blacks and the Native Americans were enslaved. Do you know why? That's because they were the same race. Those Native Americans of the South and Southeast look like me. They are the copper-colored people, the original Americans. Right? The aboriginals that was found here. Right? 2 pennies, right? So, at the same time that these Europeans were doing that, the black and Native American people were enslaved and didn't have independence. And that's why 10 days earlier, 2 weeks before Independence Day, America celebrated Juneteenth. And in my last video, I talked about Juneteenth and its connection to the N-word. Juneteenth. Juneteenth celebrates what? The independence, right? Of Juneteenth, 1865. Celebrates what? The Independence Day for all the so-called, what we call African American and so-called black people and indigenous people in this country. That was their Independence Day. Because that was the day that the last plantation was shut down and the last slaves were freed. And that's why we celebrate Juneteenth, which was made a federally recognized holiday, just as Independence Day is a federally recognized holiday. So, what we have is Juneteenth every year. People celebrating the independence of the slaves, the so-called slaves, so-called black and indigenous enslaved people. And we celebrate this on Juneteenth. But then 2 weeks later, we turn around and we celebrate the independence of the European colonists, of the colonists, period. Because some of the colonists, they were made of black, white, and indigenous, right, peoples. Independence from Britain, right? So just want to remind everybody that this is what black and indigenous people are highly tied to the Independence Day and the American Revolution. And as we know, and we always remind y'all, that the N-word, right? That niggas, what we call niggas in this country, comes from the hieroglyphics in the pyramid, and the word Nigger, okay, comes from hieroglyphics. And that's in my book, NGR, What Does It Mean? Available on Amazon. Just give me a second. I believe it's page 28. So 38. Just 1 second, family. All right, page 38, I believe. So, this is from my book. The word nigger, in the derogatory form as we know it today originated around the 16th and 17th century. Some scholars say it was around the 18th century. However, E.A. Wallace Budge has at least 14 definitions of NGR in his book, An Egyptian Hieroglyphic Dictionary, and according to hubpages.com and cherryspeaks.wordpress.com, and it should be noted that none of the 14 definitions in Budge's book are demeaning. NGR meant deity, having both a male and female connotation. Therefore, nigger originally comes from NGR, Medu or hieroglyphics for deity, and has divine meaning according to these sources. So, get the book, NGR. What does it mean? Crispus Attucks was, you know, a NGR, and what they called the NIGGER. You know, so yo, get my book NGR. What does it mean? An expose on the N-word on Amazon, available on Kindle and paperback, and the audio book is available. It's being distributed out to the various online outlets and the various outlets as we speak. It's already available in other countries. We're just waiting on the American markets to receive and have it available for distribution, but it's already gone out and it'll be available soon. So check that out. And I also want to encourage everybody to check out my man. This is the Epic of Heaven and Earth Association. All right. And this book is by Doodlebug from Diggable Planets. All right. AKA C No or C Knowledge. All right. And you see it here. Story by C Knowledge. All right. Can't probably read that, but anyway. So, this is his book. I encourage you to buy that as well. Just Google the Epic of Heaven and Earth Association, and you can get that. Salute to you, brother, on your book as well. And I encourage everybody to get both of those books. So this is yours truly, General Pow Shadowz of the House of Hip Step, reminding you that ignorance breeds fear. Alright? So, therefore, we bring you the facts.
Is it demeaning or is it not? What is the meaning of NGR? Is it demeaning or is it not?
NIGGER is an ethnic slur, contrary to belief, not an endearment term, and we should only accept it in its proper form.